This is Sydney Powell, a 23-year-old whose life took a dramatic turn within her family's story. In March 2020, she was convicted of killing her own mother, Brenda Powell, leaving their community stunned. But this isn't a simple story of right and wrong. It's a tangled web of confusion and doubts. Sydney's background adds layers to the mystery. Once a promising college student, she's now accused of a heinous crime. The community is divided, torn between seeing her as a victim of mental health struggles or a culprit of dishonesty. It's a tale that shakes our beliefs about what pushes someone to do such a shocking deed. As we begin with Brenda's story, we're confronted with shocking questions. What made Sydney do what she did? Was it a battle with her own mind or something more sinister? Let's untangle the web of Sydney's life together, searching for answers in a tale filled with mystery and intrigue. But before we dive into finding out what happened to Brenda Powell, let's take a moment to send our thoughts and sympathies to her family and everyone affected by these events. Let's come together to uncover the truth and offer some solace to those in need. On March 3rd, 2020, Stephen Powell, a 50-year-old working at a steel trading company in Akron, Ohio, receives information that his 19-year-old daughter Sydney had returned home unexpectedly. Concerned as the school term was not yet over, Stephen hurried back home to check on Sydney. He found her in the basement, and after questioning her about her college enrollment, Sydney insisted she was still attending classes despite recent troubles. Stephen suggested calling her mother, Brenda, for help. He left Sydney at home to await Brenda's return and went back to work. Later, Brenda attempted to reach out to officials at Mount Union University regarding Sydney's enrollment issues. During the call, a sudden loud thud and scream were heard, followed by a disconnect. Concerned, the university staff tried calling back, but the phone rang unanswered, and finally it was answered, only to hear a voice that sounded like Sydney impersonating her mother. Realizing the situation, they contacted the Akron police. When the police arrived at the Powell residence, Sydney, seemingly in shock, recounted hearing a bang, her mother's instruction to leave the house, and then screams. As officers tended to the situation, Stephen arrived, frantic for answers. Sydney, showing signs of distress, was taken outside by an officer, where she slumped into a catatonic state. At the time when officers were questioning Sydney, she initially provided her name as Sydney Powell. However, when asked for her date of birth, she suddenly collapsed onto her right side. While lying on the ground, Sydney began tapping her head on the pavement and rubbing the ground with her left hand, showing signs of distress. Despite attempts to communicate, Sydney remained unresponsive, whispering phrases like, "Get out," intermittently. Upon entering the master bedroom, officers discovered Brenda Powell lying on her back on the floor, having sustained multiple blows to the head and stab wounds to the neck and arms. Nearby, a cast-iron frying pan and a steak knife were found. Brenda was rushed to the hospital, but she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Meanwhile, Sydney was also taken to the hospital to receive treatment for minor injuries. That night, Sydney was arrested for the murder of her mother. The Powell family was left in shock and disbelief as the reality of the situation sunk in. Sydney Powell's early life paints a picture of a loving family and a promising future. Raised in a nurturing environment alongside a younger brother and devoted parents, Sydney enjoyed a happy and idyllic childhood. The Powell family often bonded over picnics, holidays, and annual vacations to places like Disney or the beach. Sydney shared a particularly strong bond with her mother. Their relationship was described as unbreakable, characterized by mutual respect and affection. Despite the typical parent-child disagreements, there is no sign of tension or conflict between Sydney and Brenda. In fact, they rarely argued or raised their voices at each other. From a young age, Sydney exhibited traits of kindness, sweetness, and intelligence. She was a conscientious student with a high GPA and had a reputation for being respectful and well-liked among her peers and teachers. Despite her academic success, Sydney struggled with perfectionism and anxiety, often feeling overwhelmed by even minor mistakes. There were instances where Sydney's anxiety became palpable, such as before a chemistry presentation when she experienced a breakdown, unable to see the numbers on her test. Despite seeking support from her teacher, Sydney's distress was evident. Nevertheless, Sydney's achievements in high school were notable, including her role as captain of the soccer team and her placement on the school's honor roll. Her stellar performance earned her a scholarship to Mount Union University, where she looked forward to pursuing her academic and athletic interests. However, beneath Sydney's outward success, there were hints of inner turmoil. In conversations with friends, she expressed feelings of unease and isolation, indicating that she was struggling to adjust to the demands of college life. Despite her initial excitement, Sydney's transition to the university seemed fraught with challenges, raising concerns among those closest to her. As Sydney progressed through her freshman year at Mount Union University, subtle signs of distress began to emerge. Unbeknownst to her friends and family, Sydney's academic performance took a significant downturn, with her GPA plummeting to just 2.2. Despite this setback, she returned for her second year, but her struggles persisted. Her roommates noticed concerning changes in her behavior, including excessive sleeping, up to 16 hours a day, and a withdrawal from social activities. Despite these warning signs, Sydney kept her struggles hidden. In December 2019, she was suspended from the university for the spring term due to her academic performance. However, she chose not to disclose this information to anyone, not even her parents. During the Christmas break, Sydney returned home briefly, but then inexplicably returned to the university residential hall, where she continued attending classes despite being unenrolled. When confronted by university staff about her enrollment status, Sydney initially denied any wrongdoing, but eventually acknowledged receiving the suspension letter. Despite being given deadlines to vacate the residence hall, Sydney prolonged her stay, citing family issues with her younger brother as the reason for her reluctance to leave. Her parents, unaware of her suspension, received notifications that she was attending classes and assumed everything was normal. As Sydney's deceit continued, she spent nights in motels and her car, fabricating stories to maintain the illusion of attending classes. On the evening of March 2, 2020, Sydney found herself back at her university residence hall after enjoying an evening with friends, their weekly ritual of watching The Bachelor providing a brief escape from the pressures of college life. Little did she know, the tranquility of that evening would soon be shattered. That peaceful evening changed quickly. The next day, Sydney's dad, Stephen Powell, started his routine, thinking everything was okay at home. He trusted Sydney's mom, Brenda, to handle any problems with Sydney. But then, later that day, at 12:36 p.m., Brenda texted him, saying she and Sydney were home, waiting for a call from Mount Union's Student Affairs Office. At 12:51 p.m., Stephen received a surprising call. It wasn't Brenda. Instead, Detective Kenneth, a family friend who worked for the local police, informing Stephen about something bad happening at their home. Concerned, Stephen tried to contact both Sydney and Brenda, but his calls went unanswered. While talking to Detective Kenneth, Stephen told him to visit their house and see what was happening. What police encountered at the home was far from reality. Body cam footage from the responding officers captures a disheveled Sydney, frantic and panicked, attempting to block them from entering the master bedroom where her mother lies dying. Detectives interviewed her that night and gathered evidence. Detectives also uncovered the call with Mount Union staff overhearing the attack and Sydney's behavior, indicating she was aware of her actions until she learned the police were on their way. Detectives also learned that Sydney had cuts to her hands consistent with breaking a window. She was taken to the hospital for treatment and evaluation, where it was discovered that she was suffering from a psychotic episode. She was subsequently diagnosed with schizophrenia and a major depressive disorder, with psychiatrists describing her as experiencing her first episode of schizophrenia. Sydney's concealment of her symptoms and suspension from the university stemmed from her fear of failure and the pressure to maintain her successful image. Her symptoms escalated in the months leading up to the attack, with auditory hallucinations and self-critical thoughts becoming increasingly severe. However, once she reported her symptoms and received appropriate medication adjustments, her condition began to improve. After spending several months in psychiatric evaluation and treatment, Sydney Powell's trial for the murder of her mother, Brenda Powell, began on September 7, 2023. Sydney pleaded not guilty and claimed insanity. Testifying for the defense, 3 experts argue that Sydney was experiencing severe psychotic symptoms, including auditory and visual hallucinations, delusions of reference, and disordered thoughts at the time of the crime. Dr. Rhiann testified that Sydney only remembered flashes of the attack and was in a state of confusion and distress during the incident. However, the prosecution countered these claims, arguing that while Sydney may have mental health issues, she did not meet the legal criteria for insanity at the time of the crime. The prosecution presented evidence suggesting that Sydney was behaving normally on the evening of the incident and had the clarity to lie to her parents and university staff about her suspension. They argued that Sydney's actions, including lying to her father on the phone and staging the crime scene, demonstrated a lucidity inconsistent with psychosis. Dr. Obradovich, a psychologist for the prosecution, testified that Sydney did not have schizophrenia, but rather a borderline personality trait of malingering, suggesting she may have been faking her mental illness. She pointed to Sydney's typical internet and social media activity, as well as her engagement in a regular game with friends, as evidence of normalcy. The prosecution emphasized that mental health struggles do not equate to legal insanity and urged the jury to base their decision on the evidence presented. After deliberation, the jury agreed and found Sydney Powell guilty of her mother's murder. Following the jury's deliberation on September 20th, 2023, Sydney Powell was convicted of murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. Verdict forms unanimously found her guilty on all counts, affirming her involvement in the tragic events that led to her mother's death. Despite her plea of insanity, the jury determined that Sydney was sane at the time of the murder. Sydney's conviction serves as a reminder of the complexities surrounding mental health and criminal responsibility. While her struggles with psychosis and other mental health issues were acknowledged, they did not absolve her of her legal culpability for her actions. What are your thoughts on Sydney's case? How do you perceive the balance between mental health challenges and legal culpability? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this case compelling, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell icon to stay updated on future videos.